presentation will focus on how homeopathic medicines are made. And even if you're familiar with how that process is done, I'll probably be telling you some information that you don't know. But before I do that, I want to honor first Royal Copeland, a medical doctor who was not just a homeopath and not just an ophthalmologist and homeopath, who then moved to New York after being mayor of Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he grew up. He ended up being the Dean of Medicine at the New York Homeopathic Medical School, which today is the New York Medical College, no longer homeopathic. But he impressed so many people there that he became the health commissioner of the state of New York. And then did such a magnificent job there, including during the 1917 and 18 flu epidemic, that he was elected senator from the state of New York. And FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was his campaign manager initially. He ended up serving 3 terms as senator of New York. And in his last term, he wrote some of the legislation that became one of the most important consumer rights legislations ever written in America. And it was called the Federal Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act of 1938. And this is the legislation that actually empowered the FDA to regulate drugs. And although some of us today have some concerns about the FDA, actually, in general, homeopaths have had a good working relationship with the FDA during this time. Other people in the natural products industry have had some concerns about how they've dealt with herbs and supplements. But the homeopaths have had generally a good working relationship. That may be coming, not so good coming out, but we'll see what happens. But Royal Copeland sponsored this legislation. It was passed into law. It was signed. And wouldn't you know, 2 days later, he passed away. But his life's mission was complete because in this legislation, he also gave recognition to the homeopathic pharmacopoeia. And in this legislation, it honored the homeopathic pharmacopoeia, the United States pharmacopoeia, and the National Formulary as nationally recognized compendiums of drugs. And that's why homeopathic medicines are legal today, because of this important bit of legislation in 1938. Now, I mentioned earlier that the father of homeopathy was this German doctor named Samuel Hahnemann, who was both a medical doctor and a chemist. He also was a translator of dozens of scientific and medical texts, and in so doing, when you're a translator, that means you're not only technically proficient in that particular scientific and medical area, but you're also gathering information and only translating books that are of the highest caliber that are worthy of translation. And he spoke like 9 different languages, so he had his finger on the pulse of what was happening. But as a chemist, too, he was an avid experimenter. And when he was translating one medical text from one language to another language, it was explaining why the tree, the Peruvian bark tree, from which quinine is made, was such an effective medicine for malaria. And the author of this particular physiology text actually wrote that the reason why Peruvian bark and quinine was so effective was due to its bitter and astringent properties. And Hahnemann knew substances that were much more bitter and much more astringent, so he wondered why, or if that was true. So he decided to do an experiment on himself. He began taking crude doses of this Peruvian bark until he finally developed symptoms of toxicity of it. And the symptoms he created in himself included a fever that then subsided and he had chills. And then he went back to have a fever and chills. Just like what happens when you have malaria. You have this segment of what's called an intermittent fever of fever and chills and fever and chills. So actually, in a footnote, Hahnemann chose in his translation to disprove the author's conjecture that Peruvian bark and quinine was effective due to these properties, and said that it was most likely due because large doses of Peruvian bark caused the very symptoms that it's being used to treat, this, which is this intermittent fever. And that story is actually useful because it tells us so many different things. One, that Hahnemann was an incredible scholar of his day and age, and that he was a remarkable experimenter, even putting himself on the line in doing so. But as he began to think about it, and then he tested other substances, and then when he would give that substance to patients, he found that actually people, when they were sick, would be hypersensitive to that particular substance. So he began to test smaller and smaller doses of that substance to see if it would still have that beneficial and curative effect. And in fact, he found that it did. And because he was a chemist, he knew different ways to make the medicines, and he tested many different methods. But the one that he found to be most valuable is this method of taking one part of a tincture of a plant and 99 parts of a distilled water in glass, and he'd shake it vigorously. Now, he used glass, mind you, rather than any type of metal, because he was concerned about the metal leaching into the water and then contaminating the water. And of course, that would be true. He didn't think that would happen with glass. But as we'll soon find out, there is a certain contamination that glass creates, and that is important to the making of the medicines even. So after he would dilute it 1 to 100, he would then pour out 99% of the liquid and add in more distilled water and shake it vigorously. And do this process initially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. And for the first couple decades of his practice of homeopathy, he only used dilutions of a couple dilutions of 3 or 6 or maybe 12. Then some colleagues of his actually began to write to him saying that they've been testing medicines that have been diluted 200 and 500 and 1,000 and 2,000 times. And Hahnemann's initial reaction was total disbelief that that can't be true. And he discouraged his colleagues from doing that. But because he was not arrogant, and because he was an avid experimenter with a healthy scientific mind, he began doing his experiments and testing them on patients, and actually he found a remarkable effect. And what he and homeopaths since him have found is that, in fact, the more we do these dilutions and with shakings, each time it's 40 shakes as a minimum. So every time that a homeopathic manufacturer does these dilutions and shakings, the medicines don't get weaker. They actually have a deeper and deeper effect upon the human organism and require even fewer doses. Now, the type of potencies that homeopathic manufacturers create is that when they dilute a substance 1 to 10, you'll see an X after the number. So if they dilute it 1 to 10 3 times, it's called a 3x remedy. When it's diluted 1 to 10 6 times, it's called 6x. 12x is 12 times, and 30x is 30 times. And the x is that Roman numeral, of course, that is 10. Now, when a manufacturer makes it and dilutes it 1 to 100, the Roman numeral is C. So C stands for centesimal. So when the dilution is 1 to 10 3 times, it's 3C. 1 to 10 6 times, it's 6C. 12C, 30C, 200C, and on. Now, the other thing, as we get to what are called the higher potencies in homeopathy, when a medicine is diluted 1 to 100, 1,000 times, that's called a 1M. Because Roman numeral M stands for millesimal, which stands for 1,000, or 10M or 50M. Now, CM is 100,000. And once again, I want to emphasize, and at first blush, for those people that don't understand energy medicine, that don't understand natural healing, that we find that the more a substance is potentized, the deeper it acts, the longer it acts, and the less doses are needed. Now, what's interesting is some new research published in a leading scientific journal. In fact, it's a journal that is published by the American Chemistry Society. And the American Chemistry Society is no alternative organization at all. And in 2010, they published a study by a group of researchers in India who were working at the most highly respected scientific institution in India called the IIT, the India Institute of Technology. And they tested 6 different homeopathic medicines, and they diluted them 1 to 100 6 times, 30 times, and 200 times. And using 3 different types of spectroscopy, they were able to measure the nanodoses of the original substances in each of these potencies. And no matter what potency they tested, they found nanoparticles of the original substances. So the substances they originally tested were well-known minerals: gold, silver, copper, tin, zinc, and platinum. And other research, by the way, since then have found with other substances as well, that no matter how many times, even the thousands and 10,000 and 100,000 dilutions, that the original substance still persists in the water. And let me explain what they say as to why that happens. And this is quite amazing. But as it turns out, just conventional scientists that do physics and chemistry in a field called material sciences, that study water and glass, they find that when you put a substance in glass and you shake it vigorously, and in fact the water that is used today and over the last 100 or so years is what's called a double distilled water. So it's not just distilled once, it's distilled twice. It's what's called today pharmaceutical grade water, as pure water as we know it. Anyway, the shaking process alone has that substances blanch against the side walls. And the bubbles and the nanobubbles, which is the technical word for these very small bubbles, bring oxygen down into the water. And it increases the water pressure. The head of the material sciences department at Stanford for a couple of decades was a scientist named Bill Tiller. And Dr. Tiller estimated from the 40 shakes that the manufacturers use, and the vigorousness of the shakes is such that it increases the water pressure to what he estimated to be about 10,000 atmospheres, which is a really strong water pressure. But my point before all this is, even separate from the homeopathics, is that conventional scientists and pharmacologists find that glass isn't inert, that when you put a substance in it, and especially when it's in a double distilled water, which itself has some solvent properties, and as that substance that you're diluting blanches against the side walls, silica fragments fall off the glass walls because the glass is made out of silica. And just as our air that's around us may be full of dust particles that you don't see except if the sun shines in and you see all the dust in the room, the same thing is true of the water we drink. It's full of organic and inorganic materials. But in this controlled environment that's used a double distilled water, they actually find that there's 6 parts per million of silica fragments that float into the glass water. And then whatever substance that you're making into the medicine, because of the high pressure of the water, will be pushed into these silica fragments. Then when you dump the water out, a lot of the silica fragments just cling to the glass walls. Now, every substance that will be made into a medicine will be pushed into the silica fragments, each in their own idiosyncratic fashion. And further, then when you're diluting and shaking it, the little fragments even get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. But no matter what you do, you can't get rid of them. So using modern spectroscopy, you can measure the original substance of gold, silver, copper, tin, or whatever that persist in the water. And here's the interesting thing. For those scientists that are familiar with the human body and that are familiar with the subtle chemistry of the organism, that many of our hormones and cell signaling agents operate at this nanodose level, at the similar nanodose level that these homeopathic medicines are known to persist in this solution. So when skeptics say that there's nothing in homeopathic medicines because it's been diluted out, that's their theory. That's not according to what science has actually said. Science has confirmed, using 3 different types of spectroscopy, that the nanodoses of the original particles persist in the solutions. And what's interesting is these solutions will not have any effect unless that patient is hypersensitive to that particular substance. at that which point the organism becomes not only sensitive, it's like that C note to that C note of a piano becomes hypersensitive. And just in the way that that immunological agent of like stimulating like, that's what happens with the homeopathic medicines. So the bottom line is so many of our body works on this subtle physiological level and can have extremely powerful effects because our hormones, our cell signaling agents are all so essential for our life being. And the homeopathic medicines that we use are ultimately these nanodoses of these substances. And ultimately, and here's the really interesting thing, and this isn't even homeopathic research, this is conventional pharmacology research, that's finding that nanodoses are able to penetrate cellular membranes and the blood-brain barrier better and more effectively than larger doses. So homeopathy and homeopaths have fallen upon and ultimately elaborated upon a system of reducing the side effects of a drug and reducing the dose of the drug while not only maintaining its healing benefits, but increasing its healing benefits. But the trick to make them useful and effective is to find that medicine that matches the unique syndrome of the patient in front of you or yourself. Because you just can't give a homeopathic medicine to someone and just guess the remedy. That's not a very efficient way of doing it. The medicine really has to be individually selected based on the toxicology of the medicine, matching the symptoms of the sick person. And when that matching process is done, then a healing process is also begun.